Up next on this stage is called Beyond Missiles. It's the future of kinetics. Kinetic weapons have traditionally been in the hands of primes, but they're new startups that look a lot more like Silicon Valley startups rather than defense primes, and they're taking a more collaborative approach. This is both faster and cheaper. We have two of those companies here today to talk to us about it. We have Andy Baynes from Tiberius and Philip Lockwood from Stark. And moderating this panel is John Biggs of Resilience Media. Give him a round of applause.
I know, it's nice. So I don't know how we're going to beat that, the standing ovation. You guys, we'll figure it out. Andy, Philip, thank you for joining us. So what we're talking about right now, I'm an old hardware journalist, so I covered hardware, Linux, all that other good stuff. And from your points of view, we are entering a world in which the hardware and software that we're using on the battlefield is no longer completely controlled by, I don't know, committee, but is instead controlled by a startup that can ship a dozen warheads that are hackable on the battlefront, or on the other hand, are usable by the average person. So why don't we talk a little about, Andy, why don't you tell us a little about your background and you were at Apple first, and how that's sort of led the development of Tiberius.
Happy to. So lovely to be here. So Andy Baynes, I'm co-founder of a company called Tiberius Aerospace. My background is Apple product design. I was a part of Apple's team in Cupertino for 17 years. Then I left with a small team to start a smart home company called Nest, which we sold to Google in 2014. And then I left Google to start a business in Kyiv that focused on AI and data science. That was around 2016. Grew up that company, specializing in advanced data science. And then, of course, the invasion started. And that more or less pushed me into defense, which was not part of my plan, but that's where I am now. We're now building essentially two ramjet ballistic missiles. One is a liquid-fueled, so diesel-fueled 155 millimeter system. You can see a model of it out in the foyer if you're interested later on. That's designed to be fired out of a howitzer, extends the range of a howitzer from 26 kilometers to 150 kilometers. And we have a very unusual commercial model, which we call defense as a service. So you effectively are buying our hardware as if it's software. And we can come on to that in a bit more later on.
Philip, why don't you talk about Stark?
Cool, sure.
It's run by Tony Stark, right?
No one at the company is Iron Man, and we'll leave it at that, at
Oh.
least for now.
Okay, well, that's what they told me.
C'est ça. Stark also apparently means strong in German, which I didn't know until after I joined. Yeah, so Stark is, I think, the classic situation that we found ourselves in Europe for a very long period of time. I think sometime around the end of the Cold War, as spending on the military went down, European defense industry needed to go and continue to increase revenue and sell, and I think a lot of European weapon systems ended up in the hands of unsavory characters, whether that was fueling the Bush Wars in Africa in the 90s or thereafter. I think there was a problem in that the democratic values that we have here in Europe didn't necessarily jive with the way that armaments were being used and the types of people who were using the product and the outcome of the European defense industry. And so we had a very strong pendulum shift, I think, from many of the actors of European institutions, banks, insurers, et cetera. And I think defense became blacklisted for all intents and purposes. And that lasted a very, very long time, even as the threat started to grow in 2007, 8, and thereon, and it's shifted. So I was at NATO running the innovation unit in 2020, and we were thinking about how do we start to encourage private sector actors, the folks from the tech industry who could revamp and shift the way that defense can do innovation, how can we actually entice them to come and work with us again? And how do we get past the hurdle of defense is an unsavory business that isn't actually supporting our values? And that was, I think, quite a shift and a challenge. And so we came up with things like Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund. But even then, for the first couple of years, we were really thinking about dual use. In other words, there's got to be a commercial market, and there's also got to be a defense market. And when you're talking about weapon systems and building long-range shells or autonomous strike drones, doesn't really fit as well in that dual-use category. Not a lot of commercial applications necessarily. So it wasn't until 2022 in the war in Ukraine that we started to see the shift from private industry, whether that's the financial industry or insurers, to recognize that actually the defense market was going to grow very significantly. And so Stark found itself being created, I think, in a sense, some of you might know the story. We had a very strong company in Germany that was asked by the armed forces of Ukraine to go and build an autonomous strike drone, except for the fact that the LPs of their VC backers prohibited them from doing that. And so part of that team stepped aside and said, you know what, it's time for Europe to have a defense company. It's time for Europe to have a company that's okay with building weapon systems, and let's see how we can go and finance that. And it's been a success story so far. I think we're the fastest startup in NATO to get a major program of record from an allied MOD, and we're just over 12 months in, somewhere around 300 people and over 100 million raised.
All right, so before we go down that route, I want to talk about this idea of open source munitions. Right, so you guys ship, Andy, you ship like warheads that are hackable on the front, right? So you have engineers who are actually embedded in the battalions, and they can install new stuff, they can update it. What exactly are you allowing folks to do, and is that a good idea?
So I mean, we started out with a sort of an empirical exam question, which was really how do you keep lethality and control of the sharp edge of lethality over an extended period of time? I think we've all seen the experience of Exocet, after the first 6 months in Ukraine. It's effectively now rendered a brick. So it's like, how do you do that? And then you have a sort of a systemic corporate decision to make, which is, can you retain that lethality with a relatively small design team in-house? Or do you sort of federate that capability across sort of the Western allied nation base of engineers and technology companies? So obviously we put that to good use at Apple. When we launched the iPhone, we only had a few apps on the App Store. We had about 500 suppliers reporting into our bill of materials. Fast forward 18 years, there's 4.5 million app developers on the App Store, and several thousand suppliers reporting up through various piece part components and subassemblies. And it's very, very unusual for a consumer electronics device to hold a dominant market position over that extended period of time. So we've effectively built a managed framework called Grail, which is an AI platform for hardware, that by this time next year will probably be the largest one-stop shop for defense suppliers in the world. And we've backed it up with our own hardware design. So our own hardware design is all modular. It's completely open architecture for hardware and software. Everything in the hardware architecture is threaded interfaces, so you can screw in standard payloads. You can screw in a third-party seeker capability. So we see ourselves very much as a bus where other people's capabilities inside Grail can be versioned up and keep our capability current.
Now, Philip, you commented earlier when we were speaking that idea that somebody out in the front can just like upgrade or change is probably anathema to some organization like NATO, right?
So I think organization like NATO, let's talk about the NATO allies and Western defense forces outside of Ukraine. I think the idea of uniformed personnel, jerry-rigging, something with a warhead is completely unknown. Our safety tolerances and our risk tolerances at this stage are significantly higher than that which we see in Ukraine. And I think Ukraine has had to embrace and adopt this idea of let's be able to shift and change and very, very quickly adopt to the feedback that we're getting from the opposite side. And also, they've had to take a wide variety of different products and somehow have to figure out how that works. I don't know if allied nations are at that stage where we're willing to let our kit all of a sudden be played around with by soldiers at a company level or even at a brigade level. I think that's where we really need to be moving forward, though, in a sense of if we're doing procurement, I would like to see a world in which the companies that are developing or the innovators that are developing the new products for the armed forces actually have their engineers, developers that are embedded forward with the customer to be able to iterate much more quickly. And I think we have 9 forward land forces, 9 soon-to-be brigades that are going to be on the Eastern Front. What better place to start than by putting our engineers and our developers alongside those brigades and working much more frequently on iterating on our products based on exercises or operational experimentation.
Andy, what does it mean in your eyes to play with the hardware, right? To play with to modify the hardware on the front. Is that what happens? Do you see that happening? I mean, you said that there are actually software engineers embedded anyway. Are they able to upgrade stuff? Are they able to change it? What's their goal when they want access to this open sourced hardware and software?
So I think when you're looking at designing capability, you quickly find yourself in one or two avenues. There's one which is sort of designing to the sound of the guns, and the other is creating a sort of a paradigm change. If you're going down the latter, you then can start making sure that your system can be adapted in real time by the warfighters. And if you look at a typical composition in a brigade in Donbass or Kharkiv at the moment, you're finding those brigades are carrying around 10 software developers in the trenches, hacking away at software and so on. So I think the era of one design to cover multiple geographies and multiple types of theatre, those days are over. I think those monolithic design cycles are just not going to cut it in the future. So then the question is, okay, well, how do you activate and mobilize the base of suppliers that are currently not in defense? How do you broaden that church to people like us? When I was in Silicon Valley, for example, and we were at the early days of Nest, or we were sitting on some interesting learning algorithms. This was back in 2010, and DoD was interested in our tech, even though we were a household smart home company. But every single investor told us to go nowhere near defense. Right? It was just sort of a toxic environment to have your IP live and for you to grow a target addressable market. So then I think the answer to broadening the church and bringing the 90% of engineering capability over the line and into defense is two things. You've got to give suppliers complete assurance that they're going to be able to protect their IP. And you've got to manage that in a safe framework, like akin to the Apple App Store. And then you've got to provide them with a target addressable market. So these days of primes sort of obscuring what portion and value is attributed to, say, a thermal battery going into a missile architecture, those days also have to change going forward. So they sound relatively straightforward, but if you crack those two things, you provide a visible TAM and you protect small companies' IP, you'll get them into defense.
Mm-hmm. Philip, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of VC staying away from defense. You had to spin out to do it. What should a startup right now who's trying to build dual use or just Wartech, what should they do to be ready to start working in defense and actually get funding from VCs?
Sure. I mean, I think that defense is a much hotter market right now in Europe than it was even 18 months ago when Stark was just setting out. And so I think particularly when it comes to earlier stage, there's a larger set of investors that are more comfortable thinking about it. At the end of the day, if a startup wants to double down, let's not talk about dual use, let's focus on def tech or even weapons tech. I think they need to demonstrate to the VC the market, and there's probably two challenges there right now. One of which is how crowded is the market, both in respect of what's going on in the prime landscape, because the primes haven't disappeared, and they do get sharp elbows once you start getting some traction on them. And number two, what are all the other startups doing? Because it seems like the flock mentality of VC or startup-based, VC-backed startups is a little bit like watching 5-year-old kids play football. They're all chasing the ball and doing the same thing. And you tend to see a concentration of products. So I think if you want to do it, and you were trying to deliver a capability or an actual weapon system of some sort, then you need to figure out what is it that separates you from the rest of that startup pack, what is it that separates you from the prime, or are you building some kind of a component that's absolutely critical for this, which those are the markets that personally I think are the most attractive right now.
Just to add to that, I think since we're very new to defense as co-founders, learning as we're going, so to speak. But one of the things, my advice to startups getting into this space now would be really understand what you're good at and don't try to become another prime.
Yeah.
I see a lot of capital going into the what we call neo-primes today. I don't know if that's an entirely appropriate term for it. But the problem with this is if you try to replicate a prime model of a monolithic full vertical structure where R&D and manufacturing is under one management team, what you're doing there is you're going to handicap one or the other of the scalable elements of your success story, and one of them being R&D and quick iteration on spiral development, and the other is manufacturing. And these are entirely different skill sets. And so Silicon Valley realized this in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is why you had offshore manufacturing going on and that massive scale in production whilst bringing down cost. So I think that would be the number one piece of advice is try to look to split those two things out and offload manufacturing to those who really know how to do it well. And then I think the other thing is speak to warfighters, because capital markets are not doing that. So if we look at where investors are tracking at the moment, there's a lot of money going into redundancy and duplication in the private capital space. Far less money going into what I would call the iPhone moment of jumping over the one-way effector paradigm and really looking at totally game-changing capability.
Could I actually just, on that talk to warfighters piece, so absolutely, go talk to warfighters, know the people who are going to be using your product because you're trying to solve that challenge. And I think that's why we are looking at tech-focused companies coming into the defense space and shaking things up with innovation. What I will say, though, is having seen, particularly in the US landscape and now in Europe, plenty of founders who come from a warfighting background. I was a special forces operator. I will tell you, I very rarely use my soft background in a day-to-day, first when I was at NATO or at Stark. I think actually looking for founding teams or bringing into founding teams people who have experience with the customer that's actually purchasing your system is just as important, if not more so, particularly from the go-to-market perspective. So you need to understand the people who are working in the procurement agencies in the target markets, and especially in Europe where it's so extraordinarily fragmented, thinking about how you're going to capture this, understanding those processes, whether you're going to try and prime or whether you're going to need to partner with the primes and therefore have really strong relationships with the primes, that's existential to building hardware in this space.
So on that point, how do you maintain cutting edge hardware and software as quickly as possible, given how things change in the tech industry in general, but also as controlled as possible, because your entire upgrade cycle is like controlled by, I don't know, Intel and NVIDIA, as opposed to some guy who's making C4 somewhere, right? So you're in an entirely different world. It's very similar to your nest days, where you had to make sure that you could get all these components just in time to produce X million of these products. How do you skirt that chasm there? Because you're always have to be you're dependent on Intel, you're dependent on the big companies, but you also have to be ahead of the game in every single situation, because your enemy is going to be in the same boat, right?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of sort of threads to that, but the top one is don't move your team off program. You know, it sounds very obvious, but if you compare that to kind of how design and development is being done in defense today, you'll have your A team of designers and engineers chasing contracts being moved off the capability that they started on, and then they're on to, and then they hand off to the B team and the C team to actually do the deployment and delivery. So that, in our view, and everyone's got their own approach to this, but in our view, that's the wrong way to go about speed and focus. You keep your A team on program. You go into 3-month cadences of spiral development, and then have a very broad church of suppliers creating the resilience and the hardening of and the insurance against single sourcing to avoid the problem that you're describing there.
Philip, do you have a comment?
Double down on that. You know, if I had a dream in Europe, it would be to see more contracts like what Poland did with WB Group and the Warmate contract there, where they're basically tranching out a contract over a period of, let's call it 10 years for 10,000 systems, but they want systems delivered every couple of years, and they want to see significant changes or design upgrades on that. I think keeping your A team on game and being there to continue to iterate so that you have a new system every X number of months or so is really, really critical, and that builds that long-term customer relationship and the trust that the product that you deliver on day one will only get better over time as opposed. I think one of the limitations on that, and this goes to this idea of ensuring that your R&D and that your manufacturing are split with really strong teams on both, is your ability to iterate hardware also relies on support from your supply chain, your logistics team, your manufacturing team on how quickly they can obtain the new components necessary for that hardware to update. And so thinking about the modular aspects of the system is key, but that's also why we now talk about software-defined hardware, because we need a lot of the work to be done on the software side, as opposed to just, you know.
Yeah, and the other thing that we're probably running into on a regular basis is then the recertification of that speed. So you know, if you add a Seeker module to a bus missile design, it's got to go through the whole. You know, so that's something that, you know, at the NATO level we have to have a long, honest look at that process if we're going to deliver you know, rapid iteration on capability.
Last question before we run off. I think the top of mind for everybody, maybe not in this room because maybe they know more, will Europe and or the US ever be able to beat the manufacturing capabilities of China or in India or one of the manufacturing hubs, right? Can Ukraine ever stop importing DJI drones?
So yeah, I mean, it's important to be sort of clear about what we're describing as manufacturing there. So I tend to get a little bit philosophical about this, which is, you know, if you want to compare China, Iran, Russia with the West in terms of undeniable advantage, it is the West's ability to design and develop from an enormous hardware and software engineering base, right? It's just that base needs to be managed and focused on particular lines of capability. So you have to assume, I mean, it took 30 days for our first generation iPhone design to get copied in Shenzhen. So you have to assume that your capability is going to get copied. The question then is, who owns the keys to the almost indefinite supply of engineering and technology know-how, and that will always be the West. So I think that's, and it's not necessarily about nuts and bolts and tooling on the manufacturing floor. I think that's always solvable, and I think Europe will play an incredible role there. Perhaps repurposing some of its automotive manufacturing base as well to develop scale. But really, first and foremost, it's the ingenuity base that Europe and NATO nations have the advantage on.
Philip, last word?
Democracies and open societies foster more rapid innovation at the end of the day, and I'm a huge believer in that, and I think that's our edge. I think that we are waking up to the very beginnings of our supply chain and raw materials, et cetera, and the need to bolster our own capabilities. There's going to be a lot of public funding that needs to go in there, a lot of opportunities for major public-private partnerships. When we think about the explosives that are needed for ammunition and armaments here in Europe, and the fact that we've got one factory still producing TNT, and that's it in Europe and the United States, that's a pretty scary thought. I expect that's going to shift in the next 3 to 5 years very dramatically.
All right.
It has to.
Andy, Philip, thank you for this. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Cheers.